Hello, I am your host, Melody Ann, and today we are talking about podcasting for authors. Welcome to Author Nation Interviews. The podcast that celebrates storytelling, whether in books or in podcasts, storytelling is an integral part. And if you're ready to take that next step on your author journey, you can pop over to authornation.online to find resources to help you. Okay, let's welcome our guest. Sheryl Plouffe is the founder and CEO of Scalable Business Accelerator and the host of Cash In on Camera podcast. She has produced thousands of videos and broadcasts, over 20,000 hours of live television as a national TV presenter. Sheryl owns a training company that advises six-figure entrepreneurs who want to implement scalable systems, including profitable podcasts. She lives and works in Ontario, Canada. Let's welcome Sheryl. Hello, Sheryl. How are you today?
Hi, Melody. So great to be here with you on Author Nation today.
Thank you. Thank you. So when we had our kind of pre-show chat, I was really surprised how old you were when you started on live television. So I have to ask, were you that child, the one who's like always looking for the spotlight and, putting on shows? Was that who you were? And is that how you got into live television?
I think I remember putting on a few shows as a child, for my family, but generally speaking, no, I was very shy. I would describe it as being painfully shy into some degree. I do remember times when the teacher would call on me in class, and I just hated the feeling of that burning sensation that all eyes were on me, and I would cry, and I just didn't love all that attention. So that's how I really remember my childhood in terms of that shyness being a predominant quality of my childhood. Yes.
So how in the heck did you move from that to live TV?
I don't know. You start to wonder, for me, really, this whole journey for me began when I was 15 years old. And I started to think about and be inspired somehow, some way, inspired to want to do these things that seemed very out of character for me, meaning doing modeling, for example, or doing public speaking, getting up in front of people. Pageantry was a big part of my background at that point in time in my life. And so that was very out of character. I really don't know where that desire came from inside of me, but maybe it was circumstantial in the sense that I saw that if I wanted to change my circumstances or have a certain type of future that I dreamed of, that I would need to start doing these things that scared me. And so by the time I was 18, I was tapped on the shoulder to host a news magazine program, to which I did. It was scary, but I did it for a couple of years, and that really set me on the path toward my career.
Yeah. So tell us about that first show.
The first show was a news magazine program. So it was really a local cable access show. And I would go around town, and we would do different lifestyle stories on various aspects of life in Nanaimo, BC, which I know that is near to where you are, across the Strait of the Georgia Strait. So it's definitely something that set me on a path toward not only something that I love, but it was a talent that I think became something that I wanted to pursue.
Yeah. And so tell me a little bit about your career then. So you started really early at 18 live, but you've done a lot more live since there. Just give us a quick kind of overview of your career.
Well, I actually I didn't go to school for broadcasting or for journalism. It's something that I learned on the job. It's something that I worked my way up to. And I actually was in hospitality and waiting on tables and working at the Banff Springs Hotel and working at the Royal York Hotel in Toronto. And working in hospitality in a variety of different capacities as I was building out my dream of landing a position on television. I did want to do that. I wanted to carve out a career for myself in that industry. And then I did reach that before I was 30. And then I spent the next 17 years at the Weather Network, which is, obviously a revered media company and very successful media company here in Canada, and one of the 50 best managed companies year over year. And I was actually fortunate to be part of the leadership and management team there as well.
And that can make a huge difference in a person's career when they, because when you start, you don't know the company you're moving into is one of the best, right? You're just looking to land that job, right? So it's really, in a sense, really lucky that you landed up in an organization that was well run, and you probably had mentors and support, and that, I think that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I definitely felt very supported in that role and in that career. I loved it. It was really fantastic. But then it got to a point where, for me, I felt like, again, this tugging on the, whatever that is, that inspiration or that tug and that nudge that comes from within inside of yourself to want to move on to other things.
Yeah. So before we move, I want to move on to podcasting, but just before we do, because this is a question I get a lot from authors, and I think you can speak to it. Do we have to be extroverts to be on camera?
No, not at all. I don't
Yes.
think.
So how do we
No,
do
I
it?
don't think I don't think that's a necessary quality in order to be on camera or to speak on a podcast or to be a guest. No, not at all. And
So what?
the reason why I think that is because if we're talking about scenarios where it's an interview model, such as the one we're doing right now, where you're asking me questions, or if I'm on my show and I'm asking questions of someone else, from an entrepreneurial perspective as well, or an author perspective, if you can speak about your area of expertise, if you have a passion for a topic and you're asked a question about that topic, that's really all you need to be able to do, is have a conversation and be able to answer questions. That's why I
Yeah.
love the interview model.
Yeah, well, that's a good insight, because I know that a lot of people feel really nervous around it, right? So let's dive into podcasts. I want to talk about start by talking about being a podcast guest, because that's often where, when authors are unsure, it's like, well, then don't, if you're not sure, don't jump into starting a podcast, right? Start by being a podcast guest, get used to the podcast medium, and then I have people come and say to me, yeah, podcasting doesn't work. I've been on 10 podcasts. I haven't sold any books.
Oh, I
And so what would you say to that? So can we kind of go through this whole, it's not about going on the podcast and going, hey, here's my book, buy it. Can we kind of go through the process of becoming a successful guest?
I think it really starts with intent. If your intent is aligned and you understand what the intent is behind you being a guest on a podcast, and that you have the right strategy behind why you're even doing it in the first place. My belief is, if you're an author and you have a book, you're not going on that podcast, or at least you shouldn't be thinking of going on that podcast with the intent of selling your book. And so I think if you go in there with that intent of like, I've got to go on this podcast so I can sell my book,
Yeah.
then you'll be disappointed, because that isn't the point. The point
Yeah.
of being a guest on a podcast is to position yourself as an authority, to be able to share your thoughts and ideas with others, inspire or educate an audience. Is there a call to action? Sure, there can be a call to action, but I don't think that it's really about here, buy my book, so much as it is about, I have a book. I think that it's more about the message of, hey, I'm an author, I'm an authority, I have a book. And even if you don't sell the book per se on the podcast, you've already accomplished your goal of positioning yourself as an expert or a preeminent authority at what you do.
Right. So a successful guest doesn't necessarily just talk about the book. So what does a successful guest do or talk about?
I think a successful guest talks about their ideas, their knowledge, right? I think they talk about their wisdom in a specific area or topic, or subject matter expertise. I think that they talk about their point of view, insights that they might have about their industry. I think they talk about their story. And so it's all of these things that really collectively position that person as someone worth listening to, and that's
Yeah.
someone that commands attention.
Yes. And it's okay to have a call to action as well, right? Which doesn't have to be buy my book. It can be, can you give some examples of some good call to actions for authors?
Yeah, I mean, calls to action, for authors might be, again, it depends if you're doing this for a list building activity. Like if you're looking to build your list, which I believe is the greater, the better thing to do in a situation where you're on a podcast, is look at it as an opportunity to build your list. And so maybe you give away a chapter of your book. Maybe there is some type of complimentary thing or coaching session that you provide when people download a version of your book or purchase it or whatever the thing might be. But it's really more about the list building activity that really, I think, could be more aligned for an author who is looking to maybe, again, sell books, yes, but probably selling products and services that they've created, be it a membership or a program or whatever else there is within the construct of the products and services that they offer.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that. So some authors say, I just have the book, I just have books, and my response is that is, well, you still need to build relationships. So if instead of trying to sell you one book and walking away, if you're on my email list and I'm building a relationship with you, and then I say, hey, do you have friends who would be interested? You now have a relationship with a person, and they're not just going to buy a book, but they may say, yeah, I know people, or I could do a book club, and now I've sold 10 books. And I think there's, even just with a book, there's more you can do if you're willing to build a relationship with people rather than just hawking a book, right?
Yeah. And I think it's so important, Melody, right now in this space of transitioning from Web 2 to Web 3, meaning that we're going toward this place, really the new era, if you will, of the internet, that relationships are going to be even more important than they've probably ever been. It's who do you know? Who do you have access to? Who's within your network? Who's in your database? Who can you rely on? Who can you count on to maybe do some type of collaboration? Who can you count on to do some type of strategic alliance or promoting partners, all kinds of different relationships that you can build with someone. But I think as we transition to this place, this new era of the internet, I think that's going to be the currency, if you will, that will be paramount, as opposed to where we've been, which I think has been more about vanity metrics, that has been about the chasing of the million people on Instagram. And I don't think that's really matters or is certainly going to matter as we move forward.
Yes. And to that point, I have a little story. So I had somebody approach me, and he said, I've got 10,000 people on my email list. I'll charge you X dollars to promote on my email list. So I went to my coach and I said, well, this is, I've had this offer. And the coach said, go ask him what his open rate is. So I said, oh, I didn't do that. Right. I went back, asked what the open rate out. Tiny little open rate, right? It was 5%, I think it was, right? So 5% of 10,000. So I went back to my coach and I said, well, 5% of 10,000 is a lot less than if somebody had, a different number of email lists, but had a really good open rate. So he doesn't have an engaged open rate. So he was putting the price on promotion through his email list based on the number of contacts rather than the relationships, rather than the engagement. And that was such a good lesson for me, right? Yeah. It's about engagement, not about just pushing things out, right? So let's go back to, let's say that I have a book on the brain and gut, right? There's now we're doing research on the relationship between the brain and the gut, and the gut being the second brain. So let's say that I have a book on that. And I think, well, where should I speak? Like, what kinds of podcasts should I speak on? I think the obvious is people who like to read books, but there's probably a whole slew of other places. How can we find all of those podcasts, and how can we figure out what's right for us?
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't really start by thinking about people who like to read books, just because that's the modality in which your current expertise is packaged.
Yes.
I would think of it as the topic at hand is the mind-gut connection, or, that's not my space, obviously, but that mind-body connection, we'll call it. And so I would be thinking of, who are the ideal people who I want to talk to, who my expertise can serve. It happens to be packaged right now into a book.
Yeah.
It might also be packaged into other modalities. So I wouldn't be thinking about it as, oh, I got to go somewhere where people want to read books. I would, because that's just thinking about the modality. You want to be thinking about the expertise, that the actual topic at hand, the thing that you are an expert at, and then find opportunities where those people gather.
Yeah,
and
that
get in
makes
front
perfect sense.
of those people who are gathering under the premise of listening to a podcast, or gathering at a local luncheon or whatever. It doesn't matter what the gathering is, but you want to be thinking about, how do I get in front of those people where they're gathering? Or
Yes.
what is the common bond? Could be a group, a community. On a podcast, as an example, a host of a show, Author Nation is yours, mine is Cash In on Camera. They're coming together under a certain premise. They're listening and they're subscribed to the show because they're interested in that particular topic. They're gathering. So I would be thinking about it from an expertise perspective, not a modality perspective.
Yep, that makes perfect sense. And so what are podcast hosts and podcast producers looking for? So when authors, send an email, what is the host really looking for when they're choosing guests generally?
Yeah, I think that a host is looking for value for their audience.
Hmm.
That's one perspective. Value for their audience. Is there an alignment between what this guest would have to share about a topic for my audience as I know them to be? And I think they're also looking for, is this someone where there's alignment in terms of values? Right? Is this a person who has similar ideas, and they're not going to be caught off guard by putting someone on their platform who has a completely different set of values and now paint themselves into a corner and taint their show? I think that podcast hosts are protective, and they ought to be protective of their audience, protective of their show. And I don't know about you, but for me, my process is I have to do a podcast intro meeting, right? And to be able to figure out, like, what is the angle, and is there an alignment for values, and does it make sense to position that and put you on the platform? So I think that's kind of one aspect of it in terms of what podcast hosts are looking for in guests. And I
Yeah.
think they're also looking for guests that have the ability to carry on a conversation. And so that it isn't going to feel like dead air. It's not going to feel like pulling teeth to get information and to get that person to talk. So there does need to be, I think, some sense of comfort in the guest's ability to be able to communicate messages and ideas with the audience.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is they're looking for value for their audience, aligned values with the guest, and a flow of conversation.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. And I might add, sometimes the other thing they're looking for, and this is something that I'm always saying to authors, is be willing to promote the show. Right? Like,
Yeah.
if you go on a show and you have an audience, the podcaster is building their audience and you are building your audience. So work together to do that, right? Share Instagram posts, or tag each other, or at least promote it, right? And so I think that's the other thing that people are looking for, is some sort of partnership in supporting one another.
Yeah, I think so too. And my philosophy, I know we're going to get to this at some point, which is the idea of, from the podcast host perspective. Right now we're talking about the guesting part, but I have a very different philosophy around the advantages of a podcast for the host. And I'll get to that in a minute. But I think that certainly it doesn't hurt to have someone who's willing to participate in that partnership around promotion.
Yeah. All right, perfect. And if we are looking at these things, what do we say in the email?
The pitch, you mean in terms of how you're pitching yourself to be on a show?
Yeah, what do you have any advice for, I say listen to a few episodes, find guests who have similar topics, try to find how you're different, like show your
Yeah.
niche kind of thing. Do you have advice on what to say or what to think
I
about?
mean, for my students, I mean, I provide them with templates, but just, in terms of the essence of what we're talking about here, I think you want to position it as like, what is the value that you would bring? And so thinking about it from their perspective, not from what you want, but thinking about it from the perspective of what they're looking for, and then crafting your pitch as such, right? It's saying, okay, here's what I can provide to you. And I think you also want to do a decent job of, of doing some research that makes it and proves that you've done some research. Find a way to customize that approach. Like, don't use just a boilerplate email that you send it. Find a way to customize that approach. Look like and actually do it. It's not just looking like it, it's actually doing the research and going in and saying, okay, I listened to episode 13 of your podcast. I love what you said to such and such about blank, blank, blank. It shows that you've put some time and some energy into it and that you understand the premise of the show if you're pitching to it. So I think it's really that level of saying, well, what can we do? And that doesn't mean necessarily that you have to personally have done that research. If you have a team, you can delegate these types of research tasks to other people on your team to do it and relay that back to you. It's like, hey, I looked into such and such podcast. They did a really great episode on such and such. And I think that it would make a lot of sense for us to pitch you to this show because of that alignment.
Yes.
Right. So I don't think it necessarily means that you have to be doing that if you're in a position to delegate that to other people. But as long as you have a knowledge of why you're pitching to that show as the guest.
Yeah. Love it. So once you've been you have your spot on a show, how do you prepare for a podcast?
To be a guest, I prepare by looking back on the questions if it's been provided to me. It isn't always provided to me, but sometimes it is. And so I will review those notes. I sometimes, and actually have my notebook here, right? So I will make some notes usually, not scripting, but just writing some things down that I might want to remember, specifically around, let's say, statistics, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't want to get caught off guard and try to remember a statistic, it's a number, it's a stat, it's a date, it's a name, things like that. I will write those things down so that I have them ready and available to me. And I do think about the message that I want to share and the overarching intent behind my appearance and how I can provide the most value in that case.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. I want to move on to podcast hosting. I know I have authors in my community who have been questioning, do I want a podcast? Should I have a podcast? Can I turn my book into a podcast? So I want to turn my attention to that. But just before we do that, I want everyone to know that you can learn more about Sheryl at SherylPlouffe.com. It's in front of you right now on the screen. It's also in the description. All right, Sheryl. So starting a podcast is a big decision. And I think, I don't know the stats, but I know that some people start and then there are 3 episodes or 10 or 4, and then it just disappears, right? So, how do you know that's the right idea for you?
I think this is where we have to look at it from a business perspective. Again, most authors are writing books because they want to use it as a tool to grow their brand, to grow their business, to make them an authority in a space. And there's typically a business related to that. And that's the lens through which I see the world and my work as well. So I'll speak to it from that perspective. You have a business, you've written a book so that you can get more leads, get more clients for that business. And so podcasting is a modality that you can utilize strategically to be able to grow your business. Not all podcast trainers or coaches teach it this way. A lot of people teach podcasting from the perspective of grow your audience. And this is what I was hinting at before, because growing an audience is certainly a goal that you can attain with a podcast. However, it's typically, for most people, a long-term goal. It's a long-term approach. It takes time to build an audience of any kind. Doesn't matter if it's social media, doesn't matter if it's a podcast. It's a longer-term strategy. What happens with podcasters, authors who become and decide and make that commitment to be a podcaster, is they either don't have a very efficient system by which to produce it. So it takes more time and energy than they would like to put into it because they're also doing all the other things in their business. And they start crunching those numbers and saying, this doesn't make a lot of sense because I'm spending 8 hours producing this one episode and I'm not really, the audience isn't here. And so how am I going to monetize this? So my approach is different. What I say is, especially in the short term, especially in the medium term, you want to be thinking about leveraging your podcast to do 3 things. Is it highly likely to lead to a prospect? Is it highly likely to lead to a partnership of some kind? And by partnership, I mean, because I'm going with alliteration here,
Mhm.
partnership being a collaboration, a joint venture, a strategic alliance, some type of promotion partner, a partnership, not a legal entity partner, but like a partnership.
Yeah.
And the third one is platforms, meaning does that person have access or know someone? Maybe they have their own platform that you can speak on, or they know someone who has a platform that you can speak on, because that creates a momentum, a flywheel, if you will, of momentum in your business. You're speaking, and then that speaking begets more speaking, and then you're speaking on your own, and then you're speaking on another one. And now all of a sudden you are visible and you have momentum. So my lens is prospects, partners, and platforms. The
Okay.
long-term approach of growing the audience is certainly viable in the long term, but you have to have your production dialed in. You have to have your efficiencies dialed in so that you can hang out and be there for the long haul to take advantage of that long-term growth.
Yes. And I think that's what happens to some podcasters. They start off, and then it is taking them 8 hours. It takes them an entire day to do a, 20-minute podcast episode. And then they're frustrated because this is not what they signed up for, and they have other things to do. And then they give up. So let's kind of break this down a little bit. Do you want to add anything about your philosophy to podcasting just before we move on?
I think it's important to understand what it is that you're trying to do, right? What are, again, back to intent. The intent behind the podcast should be it does so many things, but it positions you as an authority, practically an instant authority. It allows you to crack the door open to relationships with people. And if you have a good strategy of who is it that you want to meet, you can utilize your podcast to be the door opener to that potential relationship that you want to, as opposed to a cold DM or a cold email asking someone for something. This is a reciprocal approach, in that you're giving something without asking for anything in return. And I do want to just preface this by saying, Melody, that this is about coming to this with a good open heart, a giving heart, a goodwill heart. This is not about who can I invite onto my show and I can get something from them. It's not that energy. It's really about this idea of openness and saying, I want to provide this person with a platform to share the message that's important to them. And if something good comes of it, great. My strategy is that it's highly likely that it will, but it doesn't mean that I'm going at it from that perspective of I've got to get something out of this. It's more about the reciprocity.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I always think of my podcast as a triangle, and at the top of the triangle is my audience. And if we are not looking after my audience, there's no point in having a podcast, because my audience is the number one reason I podcast, number one reason I do the show. And then I think about my guest, like, how am I supporting my guest? And what can I do to support my guest? And then the third piece of the triangle is me and my business, and how does this then support me? So I always think of it as a triangle, with the audience being the most important, and then my guest and I balancing out the bottom, lifting up the audience. That's always my image of it, right? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I
So
think it's really about that idea of that it's not just about, it's not just about podcasting and just throwing anything up. Like, there has to be some intent behind what it is that you do.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I think that's really good advice. So if we've done this, right, we've kind of thought this through, how do we not spend 8 hours, right? So what are the first 3 steps that you would suggest somebody do to start a podcast? And then I think my next question will be is like, how do we do it without spending so much time? So this is kind of a 2-part question. How do we start, and how do we maintain it without losing our sanity? Let's start with, how do we start?
The starting is the same for podcasting as it is for YouTube channel growth, which is another thing that I specialize in doing. And it's the same step, which is the planning phase. That is the first step. It's not recording anything. We're not even there yet. We're not even recording. We're not getting guests. We're not pitching. None of that's happening yet. You have to start with the planning phase. And that requires some research, some thought, some intent, You really have to sit down and think about the strategy. What are we trying to accomplish here? Thinking about let's say in a podcast scenario, some of the things that you'd want to do in the planning phase are you're going to want to figure out the keywords, the topics, the intent behind the show, the run of show. Like, what will that look like in terms of your process? You do want to spend some time thinking about production and understanding, well, how is that going to work exactly? I love the idea of using tools like what you're using, and the one that I use is Restream, to be able to mitigate or to eliminate almost practically entirely the long post-production process. And that there are ways that tools that you can use today that allow you to be much more efficient. But I think in the starting phase, it's really going to be all about planning. It's going to be really thinking about the intent, how that's structured, what the production process might be. I think it's auditing a little bit of who do I have on my team, if any, who have skill sets around these certain areas that might be able to move into specific roles around the production of the podcast. It's really about your concept of the show. So conceptualizing the show with the intent of, again, prospects, platforms, and partnerships in mind. So what's the title? What is it named? What the artwork we're creating? All these different things have to be figured out in the planning phase.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really good advice. And would you also say, have a few set up before you start? Like, don't, some podcasters, they're hustling to get each episode done. Do you say, like, have a few, set up and ready before you launch? Do you launch with like 5 out? Like, a lot of podcasts, they do like the first 5 episodes all at once. What's your thought around that?
I think it depends. I think if you're doing the DIY side of things, like if you're learning how to be a podcaster and you're going to execute this, you yourself or your team is going to be doing it yourself, you're not hiring it out, you're not having someone else produce it for you, then I personally don't subscribe to the idea of a big launch, because I don't believe that most people's audiences are waiting with bated breath for you to launch your podcast.
Right.
It's a big deal to you because you're starting it, but
Yes.
most people are not waiting there going, oh, I can't wait to see the podcast. And so back to strategy, if my strategy is to launch a podcast so that I can get partners, prospects, and platforms to speak on, then I'm not as concerned about a big launch, because a big launch is about audience only, and it's about driving getting on New and Noteworthy, and it's getting the downloads, and it's trying to get sponsorships and advertisers. That is all predicated on audience building. That's the monetization model. So my philosophy is different. The monetization model is you're selling your own products and services. You're building your own network, and you're selling. That's how you're monetizing it in the short and medium term. Yeah. So if that's true, then you don't need to have a launch.
Yeah.
Now, if you are outsourcing it and that's a different conversation, and it might warrant maybe something that's a little bit more, say, pre-planned, or having some type of launch model in certain cases. But I think if you're DIYing it, you don't need to do that.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. And then along the lines of doing it yourself, how do we minimize the workload? What if an author is like, they're just going to do it themselves? How can they minimize the workload and not spend an entire day per episode and then give up?
You have to eliminate editing. And post-production. Post-production meaning the production of a podcast after it has been recorded. So, I love Restream. It's something I've been using and teaching for quite a while. Have a little mini course on that as well. People want to reach out, I'm happy to talk to you about having access to that. But Restream is a powerful, or a live streaming tool where you can go to multiple platforms. A multi-streaming tool is a great way to produce your podcast if you're DIYing it, because it produces it for you, right? And you can, with a click of a mouse, be able to add elements to your broadcast, overlays, lower thirds, music, video clips, any number of different elements that you want to add to it with a click of a mouse. In my day, back as a TV broadcaster, and having spent many, many hours in edit bays and in the control room, and around people whose job it was to be a switcher. There were people whose job it was solely to do just that. Now these tools are available to all of us and we can execute on those ourselves. It's very powerful. But the key really, Melody, is to eliminate editing at all costs.
Yes. And that's what I do. I don't do any editing. We go live. I have, with a click of a button, I do the intro, the outro, I put things on the screen, and I keep it fairly simple. And so I love that answer, because that was my answer. It's like, I don't want to do editing.
But let me share one other point of that. It is, if you can avoid editing, then do so.
Yeah.
But there are certain cases, and the reason I also love Restream, you do have the option and availability of pre-recording an episode.
Yes.
But you do it in what we would call a look live, meaning that we're recording it, but we're recording it as if it was live.
Exactly.
And this allows you now to have the best of all worlds, right? Where you can produce it without there needing to be a lot of excessive editing, because you're still making it, you're producing it as you go.
Yes.
So that the final product can be scheduled out at a different time and date in the future. So you didn't go live, you recorded it as if it was live. Yeah. And now you're putting it out next week when you're on vacation in Hawaii. And so it's something that you want to think about, these different production tricks to be able to figure out, okay, what's going to work for you. It might be going live, it might be recording it and setting it to go streaming out at a certain time. And maybe in certain cases, you could do some light editing if you did have a skill set around that. But I think you want to try to avoid editing for most people if you can.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And thank you. That's such a good point, that you don't have to go live. You can pre-record and not edit and publish later. Such a good point. Before we wrap up, is there anything we've missed about being a podcaster that is important to share with the audience?
I think the big thing that I would have any aspiring podcaster or someone who's doing a podcast, maybe has just started, is feeling a bit frustrated with, is this worth it? Where's the ROI? Is because you need to be thinking about your monetization strategy. And maybe your monetization strategy isn't dialed in, and that's why you feel there's a bit of a disconnect. There are a lot of moving parts. There's production, there's concept, there's intent, there's audience, there's pitching, right? There's all these different moving parts, but at the core of it, it's understanding why. Why am I going to do this? How is this going to benefit my business? And there are a lot of different considerations in terms of monetization to make it work for you. You can make it work for you. You can do a podcast in as little as an hour per week with the right strategy. You can do a profitable podcast in as little as an hour per week if you have the right structure and the right intent behind it.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And so prospects, partners, platforms, when we're talking about ROI, is that correct? Correct. Since we talked about it, let's bring that back just to drive that home. Perfect. Thank you. So Sheryl, you actually have a list of tools that you recommend. And if you go to the description, you'll see there's a link where if you're watching, you can jump on that, get a list of tools if you're thinking about starting a podcast, so that you don't have to spend 8 hours a day. So Sheryl, can you tell us a little bit about the list of tools you have for us?
Yeah. Well, I put together a PDF that is helpful and it has links in it, etc. That is really a conglomeration of the tools that I have found are the most useful for a budding podcaster. Someone who wants to do it in the manner in which I've described, and to want to do it efficiently in an hour per week and avoid editing, avoid all the excessive post-production. And there are some tools in there that you can download and be able to understand that. The only thing I would say is that in the online space that we are in, and in the AI space that we are in, these tools are changing all of the time. I just learned about a new tool that's not on the PDF yet last week, right? So it's just, there is this ever evolving nature to this with tools and technology. So just be aware of that new, especially with AI. And that's something that's being integrated in a lot of my teaching and coaching right now too, is these AI tools are changing all the time. I have a long laundry list in my office right now of, another one, another one, another one.
Yes.
So I'm almost debating if I should turn that PDF into a website that I can then change on the fly, because it's changing that rapidly. But I would just say this: you can download that PDF, get a sense of what and then reach out to me, right?
Yes.
Say, hey, I got your PDF. I'd love to take you up on your 15-minute call, figure out, what is a quick win? Help me get a quick win.
Yeah.
I'm always happy to do that with people who are looking to build a business.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I would encourage people to download it. And I know things are moving quickly, but here's one thing I've learned, especially when things are moving as quickly as they are right now, and you're new to a particular space, you don't know what the good tools are and what the not good tools are. So even if, there's not the most updated tool on a tool list, starting with a tool list from someone you trust is a good place to start. Right? I just want to point that out, because it's better to have, good tools than it is to have the most recent tool that really is the wrong tool.
I 100% agree.
Yeah.
I think that could be a whole episode unto itself, just tools, because
Yeah.
it's just, there's so many different ways to do this. I know that I feel like I'm put myself through the ringer, and so to speak, and been a crash test dummy of a lot of different tools,
Yes.
so that I can speak to it from the perspective of experience. It's like, I've tried these things, this one's the best,
Exactly.
and I feel like that's part of my responsibility as a video strategist and as a business advisor, is to put myself through these things, and sometimes even invest in tools to learn firsthand whether or not I would recommend that tool to someone else.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And you talked about a 15-minute call. Where can people reach out to you for that?
If you just go to SherylPlouffe.com, you'll be able to access my signature card there. And that's like my, link tree links, if you will, right? It shows all the resources, all the social platforms where I'm speaking, including Author Nation, right? Is anything that is pertaining to the here and now is on there. So you can just look that. I put a link in there. It says book a 15-minute call, learn about working with Sheryl, book it. Happy to spend 15 minutes, give you a quick win, and then move on.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So if you're looking for Sheryl, you can go to SherylPlouffe.com. There you can find a list of tools. You can get a 15-minute call with the promise of a quick win. I love that. Thank you very much, Sheryl, for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much. This has been really great and a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Good. Wonderful. I'm so glad. All right. Thank you for joining us on Author Nation today. We are a community of authors. So join us and find your place among successful nonfiction authors who are like-minded like you. So next week, I'm actually really excited. Next week, we're talking to Melior Sims about her journey crowdfunding for her book. And I know there are people out there who really want to know about that, and you're going to learn about it next week. We'll see you then.